discussion. On behalf of the PG Department of EMEA College of Arts and Science and KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri, I welcome all of you to today's program, including teachers and students from other departments and all other persons who have joined to listen this talk. Abdullah Abdul Hamid is an assistant professor in English, Zakir Hussain Delhi College, University of Delhi. He holds a master's degree in English and Comparative Literature from Central University of Kerala and MPhil in English from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His research areas includes translational studies, comparative literature, and post-colonial studies. He had worked in Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, Kannur University, and various other colleges under DU. Delhi University. He was a UGC DAD visiting fellow at the Göttingen University, Germany, and a junior research fellow of the University Grants Commission at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Abdullah Abdul Hamid sir to deliver the talk on the topic Antonio Gramsci, Hegemony and Reading Literature Today, an introductory discussion. Sir, please.
Good evening. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you are audible.
Yeah. Should I keep the camera on or should it be turned? When it depends on the browsing speed at the student's end.
It's your choice. You can have.
I am fine with either.
No.
So anyway, okay. So good evening, everyone. Without much ado, I would enter the discussion. The topic that has been assigned is Antonio Gramsci, Hegemony, and Reading Literature Today, an introductory discussion. One thing I kind of missed out while we were discussing, to finalize this topic was I wanted to put it reading narratives today, not literature. But anyway, I'll kind of get into that part where we'll be talking.
Sir, you actually muted your mic. Please do unmute.
Oh, sorry. Now that happened. Anyway, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So I was saying that the topic mentioned reading literature today, but I wanted to specifically talk about reading narrative today on a broader sense, not just literature in particular, but literature, is a major narrative, major element of narrative and narrative making, or discourses, etc., etc. So we'll talk about.
Sir, you are not audible.
It looks like somebody is muting my mic, I don't know how did that happen. I could see that somebody has muted me.
Oh, how come we are not?
Okay.
Because only me and Jilly has access to do that.
Okay, I don't know how did that happen. Maybe it was somebody fidgeting with the mobile. Okay,
Let's see.
Because ideally that's not possible in G Meets. Anyway, so we were talking about. I was talking about reading narratives in general as to understand the context of society, culture, economics, and politics as we live in the contemporary scenario, especially in the context of Kerala, because I assume that the audience are per se Keralites. And so it's easy to bring European examples, but it is significant that we understand our context. Especially our context is something which kind of considered to be allegedly the first place on earth where a Marxist or a communist government was democratically elected, So, and that came into power. I mean, despite its the duration for which it survived could be a matter of later discussion or a different discussion. But a place where a communist government was democratically elected for the first time. And that part of a communist government being democratically elected is something that we need to emphasize, and we need to understand, on that, because communism per se, or communist governments per se, did not, across the world come to power through democratic means of, adult franchise exercise, like the voting, system. But they came through revolutions. If you take primarily the case of, predominant communist countries, say, Soviet Union for one of the predominant cases, and China, for instance, Soviet Union, for instance, the Latin American countries, for instance, the Koreas, for instance, there was revolution. And different kinds, of course. It's not primarily a working class revolution as Marx would have originally, envisaged it, but different kinds of revolutions. Of course, the Russian case, the Soviet, case per se, that there were disgruntled classes among the bourgeoisie, among the feudals. Many aristocrats, had discontents with the Tsars, etc., etc., and many in the military kind of had disgruntled. And that as he was returning from Eastern Russia, it was the military, almost like a military coup, that kind of stopped him from entering back to the capital, etc., etc. So it's not a kind of large-scale working class revolution per se that toppled, authoritarian regimes or monarchs, as Marx would have envisaged it, but there were this coming into power of what you call communist regimes across the world were not part of democratic election process. But in Kerala, as they claim it to be, for the first time, communist government was elected democratically, and they still claim that as a continuity. And much of Kerala's social development and economic development and welfare state, functioning, have been attributed to this presence of the left, and communist to a certain extent. I wanted to kind of bring in one introductory point as to contend that idea that it's because of communism, because if you look in to the structure of democratic setup, because India is a democratic system, and the federal states per se work with a democratic kind of setup, wherein the democratic election process doesn't happen because of some working class revolution or struggle or something else, but because of a kind of default, electoral system that the founding fathers of our nation kind of envisaged and put in practice. As India became a republic, as India became independent country and republic in the early years of the modern Indian nation. And if you look into Kerala's structure per se, it was not a communist kind of government or economic policies, but to a certain extent, a kind of socialist democracy, one would say. The welfare state in Kerala has been, and something that a Nehruvian socialist democracy per se. That kind of sustained, irrespective of the governments, whether it was a left-leaning government or a right-leaning government, which was in power, a kind of social democratic, socialist democratic, kind of an exercise in power that ensured a kind of egalitarian and equitable distribution of the state resources. When you say state resources, I mean the fundamental access to welfare states facilities for people, and which is accessible to a certain extent, I wouldn't say all, but almost all sections of the Kerala state, the population. When I say this, I mean specifically two aspects. education and healthcare, because these are the foundational principles of a modern civilization, education and healthcare, which are in a way accessible to all. And why I'm saying Kerala, because outside Kerala, if you go into other states in India, they are not as accessible to people as it is. These two elements are accessible to people in Kerala. Of course, there are so many sections of society still where you do not have access to education or healthcare, and but kind of let's hope that we'll become a better civilization in the process. My contention is that as a point of reference to begin with, that this kind of a narrative in the air, and that has been sustained through films, through literature, through intellectual discourses, through mass media, etc., etc., that it is all because of a kind of communist governance structure, and then by default as a consequence of that economic and social structure, that this has been possible is a lie. This has been possible because of two predominant aspects. One is a foreign return, that especially after the 1960s and 70s we Keralites per se started. First it was the seamen, and then of course the Gulf and the European and other migrations that started, the diasporas who was sending money back. So that foreign return is something that to a certain extent helped the Kerala's development, along with a socialist democratic setup in the governance system, which was not Marxian but Nehruvian. Now coming back to the subject of discourse as to Marxism and Antonio Gramsci and hegemony, and through which reading literature and narratives for that matter. Antonio Gramsci, I wouldn't get into the Wikipedia kind of introduction to Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, as you know, was an Italian Marxist activist and intellectual who was put in prison by the Benito Mussolini regime, and in the prison he wrote a series of pamphlets which were simply called prison notebooks, where he kind of dealt with many aspects. Of course, he talks at length about intellectuals, and maybe we can have a talk on intellectuals. I referred to intellectuals in the beginning, and in the context of Kerala, of course, a discussion on intellectuals and intellectuals in the Gramscian terms and intellectuals in our contemporary understanding is very important. Yes, so many intellectuals in Kerala. I think a serious discussion on intellectuals is very relevant. Yeah. Now coming to the point, Gramsci wrote a lot on intellectuals, culture, society, politics, economy. But one major aspect that he dealt at length with was hegemony. Hegemony is a predominant aspect in Marxian discourse, or in Marxist discourse, so to say. Hegemony is a Greek word which simply means dominance. And that Marx famously called ideology as false consciousness. And he called religion as opium of masses, opiate of masses, etc., etc. Now, what is hegemony in Gramscian terms? That's something that we look into. And what is hegemony per se in Marxian terms? And what is the relevance of you or talking about Antonio Gramsci and hegemony today in our context? And why, as of course we are talking in terms of literary theory and reading literature, but as students of literature and culture, how we can use this idea of hegemony, understanding of hegemony, and a kind of Gramscian understanding of hegemony into our reading of literature and culture in today's Kerala. Of course, not just literature. When I say literature, take it for all narratives. because hegemony is not just, persecuted or executed or imposed through literature. Literature is just one element. It's mostly done through mass media these days, and films, of course, is another element where hegemony is, imposed through, because literature has become less and less of a popular culture element because of the mass media entertainment modes, and also films. Like, they some scholars say that poetry was the popular culture of the theater was the popular culture of, say, in the 16th and 17th centuries. Of course, poetry had its, its impact, but then poetry became a predominant, especially in the romantic, period, etc. But 20th century, to a certain extent, novels took that space, even though poetry and drama, everything was, there. But you have predominant novelists coming in the later 19th and early 20th century. But 21st century, film has taken that space of the popular culture. And I would say uh, in the third decade of 21st century, as we survive, we are living in, film used to be a very predominant tool of public discourse, not just of popular culture, but films have become a film as a tool, even though, Gramsci would say it's all possible, like, or for that matter, if you go back to Walter Benjamin would say, we have to use films, because that's the most powerful popular culture, medium of public discourse today. And we have to use films to counter all hegemonic forces, capitalist, fascist, all sorts of forces, so to say. But films today do not just give you a story. They have become what Adorno and Horkheimer would say, culture industry. Films have become an extension of the popular media, which is a popular culture, which in a way is one element in the economic structure of what we can call culture industry. Now, because films don't just sell a story, they sell commodities. Okay, and how do they sell commodities? That's a topic for another discussion. Now, but when I say narrative or literature, I'm saying add all these elements, films, mass media, for instance, like what do you call, these news hour debates, these news hour debates, roughly the debates happen. I mean, rarely debates do happen. I mean, this kind of narratives, a set of narratives are spread to the public consumption, for public to listen to and believe. A set of narratives are spread through news hour. Mass media is one very big, machinery of the public narrative, and hegemonic forces use that to spread their narrative. Now, what is this hegemonic forces? All this is coming back to it. Now, there is something called ideology. Ideology is what Marx called false consciousness. Means it gives us a sense of consciousness that we kind of understand everything as they are, and we believe that things are all fine. We get that kind of consciousness. But Marx would say that that's false, because you are only given to understand that everything is fine, but things are actually not fine. Now, what ideology does is, ideology works as a screen to give you a view of the world as normal, while things are not normal. I mean, he is talking it in the context of the working class. The working class is made to believe that their situation is natural. The fact that they have been oppressed is not understood or cognized or comprehended, and they would accept the way things are. How does that happen? That happens through popular culture, that happens through ideology, that happens through religious system, that happens through education, a lot of things. Now, this is where we need to take into account what we, a later Marxist theoretician, Louis Althusser, and in literary theory especially, Antonio Gramsci and his, writings on intellectuals and hegemony were brought as a predominant aspect of literary theoretical discourse because of a certain deficiency in Althusserian understanding of the way power structures work. Althusser, and for that matter, Foucauldian understanding of the way power structure works. Althusser had these two terms through which he defined the functioning of power structure in a society and how dominant class. There are basically the Marxist definitions of society as what you call binaries. You have Marxist understanding works to a certain extent through binaries. You have the working class, what you call the proletariat, and then you have the bourgeoisie, the land owning, erstwhile land owning, but the machinery owning, the company owning, the factory owning class, or what you call the capitalist, in modern terms, but the bourgeoisie. So you have the capitalist who is apparently profit making, who is owning the factories, who is making profit, who is accumulating profit, and who is controlling power structures, who is controlling the government, who is controlling religious authorities, who is controlling the judiciary, who is controlling the police, who has access to all kinds of control, who is controlling the mass media, the publishing industry, etc., etc. Then on the other side, you have the working class who are working like, now you have, of course, the clock time, but they work from morning to evening, and they are not paid enough, and because they are what Marx would say alienated from the, because the very process of production has been compartmentalized into multiple parts, in which they have been removed, or they have been alienated from a holistic view of the entire product, and thereby from the profit of it, final consequence. And the factory owner, the capitalist, makes profit and accumulates profit, and there is no equal distribution of the accumulated profit among the real owners of production, or that final outcome, which is profit, who are the working class, right? Who actually made products, commodities in the factories, who worked to produce something. Say, if I'm speaking in front of this laptop, and the people who produce this laptop do not actually have access to the profit which is made out of this laptop. Somebody accumulates profit. So 100 laptops are made. So if 100 laptops are made at the cost of a labor charge of 1 lakh rupees, for 100 laptops, a kind of amount or money will be accumulated as profit, which would be far from the actual cost of labor that has been given. But the fact that this labor produced this laptop means, in effect, that whatever is accumulated, whatever is the final revenue that is generated by this laptop, actually goes to the people who produced it, isn't it? People put together, or those who produce parts. So the cost, the real cost, the making cost, is not the final cost. The difference between that, goes to the pocket of those who own the, laptop factories, maybe, companies, maybe, and which is far from the real working class wages or salaries, whatever it is paid. No. So you have a binary, the capitalist, and another binary that Marxian understanding has is the base and the superstructure, the economic base. The economic base can be defined as the material conditions of our existence. The salary that we get, the cost of life, the amount that we have to pay for our food, our stay, our healthcare, our education, our clothing. The material conditions of life. The cost and quality of life. The superstructure is everything that is beyond it. That kind of makes us believe that our material conditions are fine, they're natural, they're as they are destined to be. If we are poor, we are destined to be poor. The fact that we are poor is natural, etc., etc. And then this superstructure is what we primarily call culture, but culture includes also politics, power structures. You have the legal system, the police system. You have the mass media, you have religion, you have education system. You have organization, social organization, everything. Which is part of the superstructures. Economic base and superstructure. These two binaries, again a binary understanding. And the foundational Marxian principle there is a dominating what you call oppressing, exploiting bourgeoisie class or capitalist. There is an oppressed, exploited, suppressed, victimized proletariat class, the working class. These are two, foundational principles of classical Marxism. Now you have one more fact to be added to it, that the fact that this working class is oppressed is not actually understood by them. And this oppression, this exploitation actually produces profit, wealth that is accumulated by the capitalist, the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, the exploiting class or the victimizing class. And there is a need to enlighten, awaken the victimized class, to tell them of the fact that they have been victimized, they have been exploited, and they have been kept disunited by the victimizing class, and they have been kept unaware of the means of their own exploitation because of the functioning of ideology through the mass media, religion, popular culture, etc., etc. Now, the fact that they're exploited is a reality. And if the working class can come together and if they can be awakened, there is certainly a possibility that they will come to an understanding of the fact that they have been exploited. They will unite, and because the victimization is directly linked to their material conditions of life, and the realization will come that the exploiting class is having a better living condition through exploiting this mass of working class, revolution is possible. And workers of the world will unite, and then there will be revolution. So that's why he says, because the victimized have nothing to lose but change, but the fact that they're victimized. So they have nothing to lose, hence they can revolt. If you have something to lose, you can't revolt. So they have nothing to lose, then they will revolt. And because that possibility that they can revolt, working class revolution will be a reality. It will come, and it has never happened by them. Especially where Marx said that this will happen. In the heart of industrial capitalism, working class revolution did not happen. That is Europe. And instead, you of course had democratic, nationhood, but you also had fascist regimes like that of the Nazi regime in Germany, the fascist in Italy, etc., etc. And that is why Antonio Gramsci looked into these classical proposals of Marx. And of course, they are the vulgar Marxist understanding of what you call the classical Marxist understanding, orthodox Marxist understanding. But working class revolution will happen because the conditions are real. These are not some imagined conditions. These are real conditions. People have been exploited. Gramsci looked into it and he said, he thought about why it did not happen. Why revolution did not happen. Now he talks about two terms, consent and coercion. Consent and coercion. consent, C-O-N-S-E-N-T, coercion, C-O-E-R-S-I-O-N, coercion. Now, we stopped at Althusser. I'm going back to Althusser now. Althusser talks about the way ideological structure works, or the way ideological domination, as as Marx said, what he called the false consciousness, how through ideology, the victimizing class or those who control the means of production actually control people. Now, Althusser says it is done.
Hello, Abdullah sir. I think there is some technical issue.
No, as it's I mean the resource person's network issue. I think
Okay, let's wait.
it's all it's all clear here. Jelly sir, you may
Yes,
disconnect.
yes, sir. We are doing. I think some power issue happened there, it seems.
Okay.
Jail, he will be back soon. He has some technical issues over there.
Yeah. Let's wait. All please be online. He'll be back in a minute or two. He's having some technical issues there.
Okay, am I back? Sorry for that.
Yeah.
Interruption.
It's okay. It's okay.
Suddenly there was a electricity discussion. So okay, we were talking about Althusser. So Althusser said this ideological domination or ideological control works through what he calls apparatus. He says there are two kinds of systems how which the state or those victimizing or controlling structures of power actually control people. One, what he calls ideological state apparatuses or ISA, which includes what we can call say culture, religion, education systems, the organizations, social organizations, etc. And he calls repressive state apparatuses, which are the legal system, the judiciary, the police, the military, all that. Because see, how does ideology work? You do not actually, you see, the government always does not give us, or those in power do not actually give us this kind of option. Either you do it or else, or I'll fine you or I'll punish you. That is always there. The repressive state apparatus is always there. But the government doesn't always threaten us, or those in power, those who control society, those who are dominant, do not always threaten the masses, the victimized, or the controlled, the controlling and the controlled. This again, now the binary is in another binary in the Marxian understanding. The controlling class do not always threaten the controlled, that will victimize you, will punish you, will kill you, will incarcerate you, etc., etc. No. The majority always gives in to ideology, to law. How? Because you always do not face this, that like if you say, for instance, if you have to go to a metro, Delhi, I can give a Delhi example. Say if Kochi, metro, if you're going to Kochi metro, the fact that there is something called frisking, you go, you stand, you'll be frisked, and you wouldn't find any fault with that. Say tomorrow, if you are walking through the street, if somebody just comes and ask you to stop and frisk you, you would be offended, because you would say, what the hell is going on? What nonsense is this? Who are you? Who are you to check me? You suddenly will be conscious about the fact that you own your body. Who the hell is the other person who comes and frisks me, who checks my body? Who is he? For that matter, she. But at the metro station, this doesn't happen. You give in, you concede to be frisked, you consent to be frisked. You know that at the back of your mind, you know that you will be maybe shot, maybe arrested if you try to trespass. But you do not always give in just because you realize, you are conscious of the fact that you will be shot if you trespass, or you will be arrested, or the police will catch you, all those things. No, that's not that. The fear of the law is not exactly what is actually making you think that this is required. You think that this is normal, this is natural. You give in, not always because of the fear of law, fear of repressive apparatus, but because of you consider it to be common sense. Ideology works through common sense. What Althusser says is, ideology is internalized through different structures which are part of the ideological state apparatuses, which includes religion, social organizations, and there are many organizations which will help discipline the human beings as they grow. Family is a major organization, it's a foundational part of the ideological apparatus. And of course, the educational system. Schools, for instance. Gramsci talks about, of course, schools. Now, how does this work? And you must understand one thing, that it is not always through choice. We think that these are choice, there are so many choices, but it's not always through choice that one accepts ideology. But we do not actually realize the fact that we do not have a choice. Say, for instance, I'll give you a minute example of how this distinction of gender works through ideology. I'll come to the Marxian, kind of the economic, strata or the class structure, but a simple, example, how we make a distinction of gender roles. Children as old as 2, if the child is a girl, the child is given kitchen sets to play with, dolls to play with. Child doesn't ask for it always, but child is given. If the child is a boy, you give him cars, guns, what do you call all those? Kalashnikov toys. trains, buildings to make, etc., etc., to create future engineers and this. No, we don't do it consciously. We do it unconsciously, and that's why the problem. We do it
No. You are there. You are there. But the light seems off.
Light went, maybe I'm connected to the mobile.
Yeah, then it's fine.
Light keeps going here because of some disruption. Anyway, now I'm here. So this distinction is ideological, but we do not realize it. We're actually perpetuating ideology when we do this kind of distinction. The fact that a 2-year-old, 3-year-old child is given kitten toys to play with, dolls to play with. If the child is girl, and if the child is boy, the child is given vehicles, models, or trains, etc., etc. Now, this is the level at which ideology works. In the education institutions, as they go in, they are made to sit separately, gender-wise. And most of these things are internalized. This internalizing process happens at all other levels. How does the capitalist sell something? For instance, those films, the Spider-Man film, for instance. Spider-Man film, the superhero film. The superhero films are not just superhero films. They are a market. These are huge market. These are huge industries. So you're not just shown the film, you enjoy the film and then you go. That's not how it works. There's an industry that is attached to it. There's cosmetics, there's cartoon, there's cartoon character, there's toys, there's all other things which are attached to it. And we are made to buy because children like this. It's not that children are they keep a gun on that you have to buy this Spider-Man. No, children like it, and children like the cartoon, children like the movies, and then they see the same toys on the market and they want to buy it. The capitalist ideology works not always through coercion, but it works through consent. We give consent. Now, Althusser says in a different note. Althusser says ideology interpolates individuals as concrete subject. There is no escape from this. There is no escape from ideology. He gives this example of a policeman calling a thief in a crowd. The policeman just has to call, "Hey, you there!" And the thief will turn 45 degrees Celsius to look back because the thief is always under the suspicion that the police called me from the crowd. Because back of the mind, the panopticon of the police hunting for him is there. Ideology works like that. Before entering a religious place, you put your footsteps out. Not necessarily because you are afraid that somebody will beat you if you don't do it, but because it's internalized as part of practice, that's natural. While as critics, nothing is natural. One thing that's Marxian theoretical understanding allows us to understand is nothing is natural. Everything has a structure attached to it, and everything has a power structure attached to it. For that matter. Now, Althusser says ideology is enough because
hello, sir. Hello. Excuse me, sir. Sir, your voice is actually breaking. Some kind of echo is actually coming in.
Okay. Maybe let me try to use my headset. Has it been coming?
Yeah, it was fine until last 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, maybe because of, maybe let me connect back to the Wi-Fi. Yeah.
Yes, now
Am
it's perfect.
Okay, so that's because of the connectivity. Okay, now I think I can go on for some more time.
Yes, yes,
And
yes, yes.
come to
Yeah.
I hope, like I had told that I have a tendency to bore people. So, and then my friend Muhammad had said it's fine, if you have to bore people. Anyway,
It's okay, it's okay.
so anyway, so see, in Althusserian terms, the state doesn't have to use the repressive apparatuses necessarily, because people accept to the status quo that the state offers, the common sense that the state offers, through ideological interpellation. So they give in, they concede. The majority, the masses would concede. Now that is where and when that masses don't concede, state will use repressive apparatuses. State can use. That's why we have the jails, we have the judiciary, we have the police. But the thing is, like, there's one thing that's very interesting. If you look at it from an Aristotelian perspective, from an Althusserian perspective, you see, laws are made not necessarily because there are thieves, there are lawbreakers, but laws are made anticipating that there can be, the society will have thieves, will have lawbreakers. And that's one fundamental problem with ideology, that ideology assumes things in advance. That's why there is a power structure. You see, in the school, when children are sent, the children consent to be taught. They give in, they concede, they accept to be taught. Nobody asks them how much you know. Do you want to be taught? Nobody asks the child. For my own personal experience, this often becomes a problem when I tell my students, I will not teach you anything. And then they ask, why? Isn't that your job? Isn't that you're paid for? You are paid to teach us. I said, no, I'm not paid to teach us. I'm only paid to help you learn. That concept of helping to learn, that's not there. You are ready to be taught. You're giving consent. Nobody has to hold your neck and make you sit in the classroom, like study. Otherwise, I'll teach you. This word "I'll teach you" is almost like a threatening word. If you actually notice, I'll teach you a lesson. If you get angry at somebody, you say, I'll teach you a lesson. It's like teaching can be a very, very threatening kind of a word. Anyway, but coming back from Althusser to Gramsci. Gramsci says, of course, those controlling classes, those power holding classes, victimizing classes, control the masses, control the majority, because go back to the classical Marxian, because the victimized is the majority, revolution is possible. Because the victimized is living in worse conditions, the material conditions of life is severe, and the fact that they are a majority, if they unite, they become a formidable force, and the victimizing class is a minority, revolution is possible, overthrowing the victimizing class is possible. It did not happen. Now, Gramsci understood this as why the victimized, the working class, did not revolt, why there was no revolution in industrial societies. Well, referring primarily to European, continent, because that is a hotbed of industrial capitalism. Why? He argued that the control of the masses by a minority was not always through coercion, but through consent. Ideology of the capitalist, of the ruling class, was not always implemented through coercion, through power, power structures through what you call military, law, judiciary, police, etc., etc., but through consent, but through creating a sense of status quo, what I call the norm, common sense. What the ruling class does is it creates sets of common sense, and everything that suits, that helps the ruling class or the victimizing class or the capitalist class to sustain their power is fed into these structures of common sense. And these structures of common sense are then, of course, they're very, in a more Foucauldian terms, they're very epistemically, charged with violence. They're not innocent, structures. But these structures of common sense are fed into the larger public as the norm. And the public at large accepts it as the norm. And when the public at large accepts it as the norm, then the ruling class doesn't actually have to take a stick and roam around, but they simply give in. And because of that, the real material conditions of the working class do not change much. This is a Gramscian argument. And this ever sustenance of hegemonic domination happens through consent. Now, for Althusser, while for Althusser, ideology is a kind of, it kind of interpolates into a permanent state of subjugation. For Gramsci, hegemony can be challenged because the common sense is not stable. They are subversive. They are dynamic. And because they're dynamic, they can be challenged. There is always, it's not that always they give in, the masses give in. There's always a conflict of control. This control of the common sense is always a site of conflict. Now that is where the war, the battle between the working class and the capitalist class is actually fought there, in the site of the common sense, in the site of culture, in the site of the popular culture, popular discourse. But Gramsci says the capitalist classes always manage to have an upper hand in this conflict. Of course, there will be conceding, a little bit of conceding, but they don't always concede completely. So there's always an upper hand the capitalist class keep, and hence continue their domination over the common sense or over the public discourse. And through control over this public discourse, they impose their ideology all the time. So ideology is the worldviews, perspectives of the working class, but that ideology is always imposed through hegemonic formulations or hegemonic practices. Is that clear? And that practice is always done through consent. This hegemonic domination of capitalist ideology always happens through consent, not through coercion. Because if there is a visible beating, then you can protest. But when a beating is accepted as natural, then one doesn't protest. I don't want to get into trouble. I also see the talk being recorded. Get into trouble by naming, a certain aspects in our own socio-political system. But coming back to what I started with, the Kerala context, where how do you use an Althusserian understanding of hegemony? Two things. There's one fact that I was already mentioned. This thing about a classical Marxian possibility of a revolution is irrelevant to a certain extent in Kerala, because the working class is not completely a disgruntled class or an oppressed class. They are the least exploited, so to say, in Kerala. And to a certain extent, the working class, at the cost of facing wrath, I would say, to a certain extent, the working class is exploiting class. I'll give some very clear evidences, to support my point. How does the working class become an exploiting class? There is this idea of the Nokukuli in Kerala. Nowhere else in the world I have heard of it, but in Kerala it is. Whether you do the work or you make the person do the work, you have to pay, because that's how the Nokukuli works. And in some places, even if you want to do the work, no, you cannot do the work, because that work belongs to somebody else and that person will do. Even if you do it, you have to pay. And wage, to a certain extent, is not defined by the person who is availing service, but the person who is offering service. You getting me? Like, for instance, you see, for instance, if you're calling somebody for a daily wage labor, the daily wage laborer's wage is not defined by the person who is calling you, someone for a daily wage labor. But the person who is going, they set the mark. And there are unions in Kerala. The working class is one of the most united, of course, divided, but one of the most unionized class in Kerala. Hence, anybody would think twice before exploiting them and oppressing them, all those things. So, is a classical Marxist kind of a discourse relevant in Kerala? I would say to a certain extent not. But is Marxian thoughts relevant in Kerala? At least Marxist thoughts are relevant in Kerala, at least in the context of Gramscian notion of hegemony. Because in the context of the intellectual tradition of the left, it is not always, we are not always, as leftist, one is not always working for bringing revolution. But leftist also means you are standing against an established form of violence, oppression, and which could be any means, for instance. So to become a leftist can mean to become a humanist. But the leftist intellectual tradition also gave us a lot of frameworks of understanding, what you call paradigms of understanding oppressive structures and oppressive ideologies, exploiting ideologies, and discriminating ideologies. One of the examples I would take is the case of Islamophobia, which to a certain extent is state funded in many parts of the world. Sure. So I'll give this one example, how to work in this narrative, when we read narratives. So Islamophobia, I hope you know what is Islamophobia. It is fear of Islam and Muslims, etc. A friend of mine once suggested it is Muslim phobia, not necessarily Islamophobia in Kerala. Now, how does this work, Islamophobia? Advocate Jayashankar had some time back Advocate Jayashankar is a media person in Kerala who had used some time back something called Kunyalipedi, which was in particular reference to a political leader called Kunyalikoti coming back from Delhi. He was an MP in Delhi, coming back to Kerala to contest election, and the fear that was kind of spread in the public arena through certain sections was that if the alliance, the political alliance that Mr. Kunyali Kuti belongs to wins this election that happened, last year, 6 months back, sorry, 1 year back, he will be either the chief minister or the deputy chief minister, which in a way will result in a huge chunk of public resources being taken away by a particular community. That was a narrative. Well, the foundation of that narrative, the basis of it, facts, evidence, that's outside. But the narrative spread. The narrative spread like wildfire, And he defined it as Kunyali Pedi. I don't know whether Advocate Jayashankar himself participated in this discourse as a narrative or he was being critical of the narrative. I wouldn't be able to judge at this point in time because the result is for everybody to see. And that was just one part of the narrative, a kind of Islamophobic or, not necessarily Islamophobic, but Muslim-phobic narrative. There's a sense of fear of a particular community taking political control, taking economic control, taking social control, which is kind of spread. How is that spread? And how is a Gramscian understanding of conflict and in counter hegemony comes into understanding this phenomenon? Now, for long, from public discourse in Kerala, now comes to literature. Malayalam literature, for instance, or Kerala literature, for instance. Muslims were either absent or marginal. If you look into Kerala literary history, it is Malayalam literary history. And in Malayalam literary history, it's only a particular, literature that is being presented. Well, Udaya Kumar, in one of his articles says, literary historians of Kerala systematically mainstreamed or put into the mainstream, presented as Malayalam literature, a particular, what he calls Brahminic, Sanskritized literary tradition, and all other literary traditions which are available in Kerala, be it the Adivasi, be it the minority languages like Tulu, etc., and the Arabic and Arabic Malayalam literature, they were all relegated into the margins. Either they were passingly mentioned as some references of under the title called folk literature, or they were not mentioned at all. And if you read Ullur's Malayalam Sahitya Charitram, you will understand this. Now, one person who kind of created a counter, element for that kind of a discourse was Moinkutti Vaidya, who created a language, a form of language which was not just Arabic Malayalam, but was he wrote in Sanskrit and so many other elements linguistically. But because Vaidya wrote in a particular script, which was not a mainstream script at that point in time, not even now, he was still relegated into the margins, despite the fact that he wrote in 19th century. Now, in the Malayalam context itself, Vaikam Muhammad Bashir tried another revolution, to challenge what Udaya Kumar calls a Sanskritized domination, both in terms of language and also in terms of culture, in terms of characterizations and thematic context, social context, which are present in literature. Now, literary history is a little absent-minded towards this kind of conflict. Now, post-1990s, so to say, when films became the predominant medium, you can go into the films of the 80s and the 90s and look at the character, themes, etc., etc., and go into the films of, say, in the last 1 decade. How did this happen? The last 1 decade, narratives of Muslim lives, Dalit lives, the marginalized lives started entering the film. And when they started entering the film, then becomes a problem, because erstwhile they were relegated into the margins, they were absent. So there's a concerted effort now to create a counter narrative to a hegemonic domination of a particular set of themes presented in films. So say for instance 10 years back or 15 years back, if Malappuram is mentioned in film, it will be mentioned with a particular reference. For instance, I'm giving a very direct context for you to understand how does hegemony work. And because films spread narratives, the idea of common sense, and that image of a particular place or a people, or a community is internalized when it is shown again and again and again and again. Now, films like Sudani from Nigeria, KL10, etc., presented a counter narrative to it. A different Malappuram was shown, a different set of people were shown. And they were vehement in arguing that these are the real people, this is the real place. And that, in a way, becomes a jolt into the in the existing hegemonic structure in the literary film, cinematic sphere in Kerala. Now, and this happens through all other aspects of Kerala's social life, be it the educational institutions, be it the administrative structure, be it politics. And when the problem is, one hegemonic structure, as long as it continues, no conflict. The moment there is conflict, the hegemonic power structures don't concede so easily. They try their best, to suppress the counter narrative, to suppress the conflict, to provide peace. They provide peace. But hegemonic structures provide peace by either making them concede or by using repressive apparatuses. Now, in a place like Kerala, I'll give you one example how this works, especially in a context of the governmental structure. Say a particular political leader would give public statements about completely, embracing and accepting and helping and standing with the community who are facing a threat of particular legal execution through a particular law that is being introduced at the national level. So that is, is a kind of, that is a way of appeasing, a way of, presenting that, see, don't worry, we are there. But at the same time, the same person goes on to register cases against the same people whom he just met and said, I'm with you. We are with you, don't worry. You see, I'm not taking names because I don't want to take names. I hope you understand what I'm talking about. Now, this is where it is important for us to understand a Gramscian form of how hegemony works. Hegemony works through consent. So the moment that person said, yes, you are our leader, he made all those statements in big rallies. So people believed, people gave in consent, you are the leader. But then in that consent giving, you don't actually notice the real oppression that comes through backdoor, the real exploitation that comes through backdoor. Now, I'm talking about the political sphere. I hope you understand that. But this political sphere conflict is not just one aspect, of the hegemonic conflict that is happening, but that is one part of the hegemonic conflict that is happening across the social, cultural, political, and economic spectrum of Kerala. And one of the main accusation often faced by a particular community is that they are accumulating lands. They are purchasing lands. This one community is purchasing lands everywhere. What is the problem? No, it's a problem because only one person is building malls all around the state. What is the problem? It is a problem because the person belongs to a community. Now that is when ideology happens. That is where ideology comes. Because spaces, lands in cities in Kerala were occupied to a certain extent by people belonging to particular sections who had hegemonic control over Kerala's social, political, economic structure. Now suddenly somebody else is trying to occupy that space. Somebody else is trying to be part of that hegemony. No, you are not allowed. How do you say you are not allowed? You create narratives. You spread narratives. And these narratives are so strong that they have this ability to capture the imagination of public masses at large to such an extent that a government can get continuation just because of the fear of a person belonging to a particular community becoming a deputy chief minister. What I'm saying is, hegemony in Gramscian terms offers the space for conflict. It's not just, as Althusser would say, completely domination through ideological interpellation, but hegemony is sustained by the power structures, by the ruling class through consent, not through coercion. But that space of consent is also a space of conflict. And that conflict is what we see in Kerala today, in the social, political, and economic, and cultural, and literary spaces. I'll rest my case there, and I'll take questions if any. And I hope I was clear, though I try to be as subtle as possible, not taking any names. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah for that wonderful talk on hegemony and Gramsci. And as you rightly pointed out, Gramscian notion would be much useful for all of us to understand the Kerala socio-political milieu of today. And ironically, in our syllabus, Calicut University syllabus, we do have to teach our students some part of Althusser and all, but Gramsci is strangely missing in most of the parts. So I hope listening to your lecture might have helped the students and the people who gathered virtually for this particular lecture might have got a entry into the Gramscian ideas of hegemony and all. So thank you for that enlightening talk. Now we can, as you mentioned, we can take some questions if there are any. So open for discussion. So questions are invited, or you can even ask if you need some clarification on what he has already talked about. You can unmute the mic and ask questions.
Hello, are there any questions from the side of the participants?
I have something to say.
Yeah.
It's not a question, actually. The talk was it's a very wonderful, informative one. It was worth listening. Thank you, sir. I have something to add. It's just my thought on it. Actually, you have mentioned about the problem we could see, especially in the name of Islamophobia, if we want to say, in the field of literature and cinema, like how the hegemony of the Brahmanical culture showed up through these minute or intricate ways of making some sect as a special kind, or what to say. My point is that it happened, and you have also mentioned about Bashir, how Bashir win hearts, win all the people's heart through his writings, how he revolutionized and all these things. And you have already mentioned about the Sudani of Nigeria and these recently coming movies speaking about the Malappuram or Muslim culture, right from the uh, right from their lives, can be said. I think that the answer somewhere lies in that, because until we start speaking about ourselves, until we start fighting for ourselves, the change won't come as easily. And in the case of Bashir, he enthroned literature at the time when we can, and if we can say his writing as Brahmanical, we can't say it as a Brahmanical writing, or we can't say empties as if an argument we can say, but as a literature lovers, we can't say empties writings are just Nair writing or anything like that. So the scenario was like that. There are space, but we or somewhere people failed to enter into that world. We know very well that Malappuram was how Malappuram was inhibited to enter into the world of cinema. So when they started entering, when they started to speak of themselves or speak of ourselves, if, in that way, it's heard. It has been heard in the scenario. So this is my point. I just want to add it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Melissa, do I respond to it, or it was not a question?
Yeah, you can respond it to say.
But maybe I would, especially when it comes to MT. MT once said, Bashir is a sultan and I am just a cook in his kitchen, you know. So maybe that sums up. But, you know, hegemony, in the context of hegemony, Gramsci talks about the consent as a manufactured consent. Okay. And that consent, once manufactured, and consent is being manufactured, is something that even maybe even a contemporary intellectual like Chomsky talks about, manufacturing of the consent. This consent is manufactured through various means. And one of the fundamental aspects of that manufacturing of consent is the idea of universal truth, universal beauty, you know, universal aesthetics, etc., etc. One fundamental way through which certain writers who spread hegemonic ideas through their writings was they were presented as neutral aestheticians or aesthetic artist, is through this kind of literary theorization that they are presenting universal narratives. And the fact that when a literary critical tradition, what in Malayalam called Nirupana, Sahitya, and the allied literary history present these writers as dealing with certain thematic concerns, which of course are given a universal characteristic, then we tend to forget the local, the peculiar, the particular, the regional, the racial, the religious, and so on aspects of such writings. And because of that, we tend to consider that most of these writers are very innocent, great writers. But I would contend that they are not. On record, I'm saying that. Fundamentally because in a very Marxian term itself, that one's worldview is constructed through the material conditions of one's life. And if that is the case, one's intellectual and creative output would reflect those conditions which actually created them. Like Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, culture produces language, language in turn facilitates that particular culture. In the same way, if a certain certain set of material conditions actually produced a certain worldview for a certain writer, that worldview in turn would only perpetuate those material conditions. And Nalukattu has a particular religious, caste, class, identity. And if one comes from that particular material condition of culture, one is tend to perpetuate that material condition as the natural, as the universal, as the common sense. And MT is not free from that kind of an inescapable bind to his material conditions. I'm talking in Marxian terms. I hope that response is sufficient.
Yeah. So, are there any more questions? If you don't have any more questions, we can actually slowly move on to the concluding part of the session.
So can I call the person who's supposed to give
Yeah.
a vote of thanks?
Yeah. Okay, Ali, you can call her then.
Abdullah Abdulhamid, thank you very much for the wonderful talk and for spending time with us, with the students and teachers from various colleges. And on behalf of the organizing committee, I welcome Amina Bani of first MA English of Unity Women's College to deliver the vote of thanks. And Amina Bani.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Here you are.
Yes. Good evening, all. It gives me an immense pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks for this event to all dignitaries assembled here. I would like to thank our Honorable Chief Guest, Mr. Abdullah Abdul Hamid, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Zakir Hussain, Delhi College, who honored this session with his inspirational thoughts, knowledge on the topic Antonio Gramsci, Hegemony and Reading Literature Today, an introductory discussion. I think the session was not that too long and the content was very useful to students like us. Even if it was online session, we could make it an useful one. Thank you so much for sir that. And I would like to thank all the teachers, all the students, each one of you for being here and making this program a huge success. And also to the team who organized this program by Research Clubs, PG Department of English, KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri, and EMEA College, Kondotty. Once again, I thank one and all present here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope I have been communicating. Thank you so much. Thank you for calling me and being such a nice audience. Bye-bye. Good night, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.